Our story begins with a man reborn as a small tree in a primitive world, where he suffers the daily indignity of bird droppings to the face. Thousands of years pass in this fashion, and over the millennia, our sapling slowly transforms into a truly massive, sky-piercing tree. He assumed his days would remain predictably dull, until the afternoon he decided to save the life of a primitive man. 3 months had passed since that encounter, when he was suddenly jolted awake by a strange commotion gathered right beneath his trunk. We see a large group of men, women, and children dressed in animal skins, leaving him to wonder where on earth they all came from. Then, the man he had saved stepped forward from the crowd and knelt down directly in front of him. The man began babbling toward the ancient tree in a language he couldn't understand, bowing his head to the ground with every word. Behind him, the rest of the tribe followed his lead and began kowtowing as well, until finally, the man fell silent. They remained kneeling on the ground for a long time without moving, which, to be honest, left him feeling a bit bewildered. After a moment, he began to understand their intent, so he rustled his leaves to create a sound that brought them all to their feet. A wave of ecstatic cheering broke out. He couldn't understand a word they said, but the joyful atmosphere was quite infectious. Feeling rather pleased himself, he watched as the group began to set up camp and settle into their new life around his massive trunk. Every time they returned from a successful hunt, the man would carefully remove the prey's heart and place it at the base of the tree. At first, he wasn't entirely sure what the man was doing, but he soon realized this was likely a religious sacrifice in his honor. To these primitive people, the heart was clearly their most precious possession, making it the ultimate offering for their guardian. After the ritual, the tribe would simply leave the heart behind, allowing it to sit undisturbed at the foot of the ancient tree. Because his trunk possessed a unique quality that repelled insects, the hearts would eventually just wither and dry out over time. Deciding that these shriveled hearts were a bit unsightly, he commanded his roots to grow upward until they finally broke through the surface. With a bit of effort, he was able to use these roots to drag the dried offerings deep into the soil and out of sight. When the tribespeople noticed the sacrificial hearts had vanished, a wave of panic swept through the group, and the man immediately led his people. They knelt before him, kowtowing repeatedly until he finally rustled his leaves, signaling the group that they could finally stand. The sacrifices continued after that, and he made a habit of quietly burying the hearts at night. After a few times, the primitive people grew accustomed to the phenomenon, their worship deepening as their leader guided them through regular rituals. These grand tribal ceremonies became a regular occurrence, and after observing them for several years, he finally learned their language. No longer worried about the language barrier, he watched as the man he had saved led the tribe beneath his branches once more. From their conversations, we learn the man's name is Shurfong, as these primitive people use only single names without any surnames. Their naming custom is quite simple. They pick a random object seen at birth and modify it slightly to create a name. In this case, the man's name translates to Eastern Peak. Shurfong stepped forward toward the ancient trunk, holding aloft a heart freshly taken from a wild boar, offering it to the tree while murmuring a rhythmic prayer. The essence of his plea was a request for the ancient tree's protection and for a more bountiful supply of prey. He prayed for their safety, for the health of the newborn infants, and for the well-being of the frail elderly. Listening to this, he couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed. They were truly dumping every possible responsibility onto his shoulders. However, some of their requests were actually within his power, such as protecting them from the ravages of disease. Because of his natural ability to repel insects, the people living under his canopy rarely fell ill, which was a nice bonus. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye, and the tribe living at his feet grew from 30 members to a much larger group. Now numbering around 50 people, the peace was suddenly broken when the hunters returned from their trek much earlier than expected. They didn't bring back prey, but rather the body of Shurfong. He had grown old and lost his life in a battle with a leopard. The tribe buried him not far from the trunk, and with Shurfong gone, a stronger man rose to take his place as leader. This new leader was named Haimu, and under his rule, the worship of the tree only grew more frequent and intense. One day, following a particularly long ritual, he suddenly felt a strange, new sensation stirring deep within his wooden body. He spent some time studying this new energy, but couldn't quite grasp its purpose until the next ritual, when he noticed the power grew slightly stronger. Could this be the power of faith? The thought crossed his mind. As the energy only expanded after a sacrifice, it seemed a very likely explanation. As he continued his observations, he became certain this force was indeed fueled by their belief, though he had no guide to explain its use. Left to figure it out on his own, he tried channeling the energy into his own wooden frame to see what might happen as the power flowed inward. To his disappointment, absolutely nothing happened, and since his reserves were quite limited, he soon found himself completely drained of energy. He decided to set the experiment aside for a while, but as time passed and his power replenished, he felt compelled to try once more. This time, he injected a much larger amount of energy, and slowly, he began to notice a subtle change in the branch he was focusing on. That specific branch began to look different from all the others, and soon, a tiny, sharp bud began to sprout from its very tip. He was certain this wasn't a normal leaf bud. As it grew larger, he finally realized what it was. A flower bud was forming. He was genuinely shocked. He had been this tree for at least several centuries, and in all that time, he had never once bloomed. He had assumed he was a non-flowering species, but apparently he was wrong. Intrigued, he began funneling every bit of faith he collected into it. He poured everything into that single bud, curious to see what kind of flower would emerge and if it would eventually bear any fruit. As the bud grew larger, he carefully tucked it away behind his thickest leaves, making it impossible to see from the ground below. Since the primitive people never dared to climb his sacred body, he wasn't worried about being discovered. An entire year passed in this manner. During this time, he focused his entire being on that one flower, nurturing it with a full year's worth of constant care and energy. He could feel that the moment was finally near, and with a soft, resonant sound, the flower finally opened to reveal a pure, snowy white bloom. 5 delicate petals unfurled around the center. It wasn't particularly large, roughly the size of a grown man's palm. Suddenly, a rich, intoxicating fragrance began to drift outward, quickly enveloping the entire tribal village resting beneath his canopy. The tribespeople came rushing out of their dwellings, looking around in utter confusion, clearly having no idea where this heavenly scent was coming from. Haimu ran out as well. As the leader, he was just as bewildered as the rest, until his gaze suddenly shifted toward the towering ancient tree. If anything in the vicinity could possibly emit such a divine fragrance, it had to be the ancient tree that sheltered their tribe. Haimu quickly called out to all his people, leading the entire tribe to the base of the tree, where they all knelt in unison. As they began their worship, he suddenly felt a surge of new energy flowing into his wooden body once again. This power was far greater than anything he had received during previous rituals, and he began to suspect that this force was tied to their devotion. The more sincerely they prayed, the more power he gained. To these primitive people, the scent was a sign of the tree's divine presence. In their minds, this rich fragrance was a manifestation of the ancient tree, so he funneled all this newly born energy directly into the flower. Immediately, the scent grew even more intoxicating, causing the tribe's people prostrate on the ground to worship him with even greater fervor. Suddenly, an old man in the crowd raised his hands in utter shock, staring at his own palms with wide eyes. His hands, once covered in deep wrinkles, were slowly becoming smooth and healthy again, and that wasn't the only change. He felt his physical strength slowly returning, as if his aging body were miraculously reclaiming its lost youth. Upon discovering this phenomenon, he cried out that the ancient tree had revealed its spirit, a change Haimu noticed almost immediately. Haimu bowed his head and shouted to the tribe that they must worship the tree, for this fragrance was a blessing upon them all. He believed the tree was using its power to grant them immortal bodies, and he prayed for it to bestow even greater strength upon them. As Haimu's voice rang out, the other tribesmen also began to notice the physical changes occurring within their own bodies. Their adoration for the tree reached a whole new level, and at that moment, Haimu stood up and raised his hands high above his head. He shouted toward the canopy, pleading for the powerful tree to become their totem and to finally bestow a name upon them. He promised they would worship and serve the tree for generations, spreading its name across the land before kneeling once more. Every person in the tribe fell silent, kneeling together and not daring to make a single sound as they waited for a sign. He realized these people had truly become his followers, and after some thought, he decided that becoming their totem would benefit him as well. And so, he controlled his branches to let out a resonant rustle. Hearing this, Haimu immediately looked up with hope in his eyes. With a face flushed with fanaticism, Haimu shouted to the heavens that the ancient tree had agreed to become their totem. From that day on, they would be known as the Tree Tribe, a name his people chanted with such fervor that even our ancient tree felt a spark of joy. After drifting through existence for hundreds of years, he had finally earned a bit of a reputation, so he released another wave of divine fragrance. We see him carefully observing the changes in these primitive people as they remained bathed in the intoxicating scent of his flower. Their bodies were transforming in various ways. The elderly grew younger, while the young men became visibly stronger and more robust. The children didn't seem to change much at first, but the influence was there. As they grew, they would become healthier and far more intelligent. He soon regained control over the fragrance, knowing he couldn't let his followers stay in this trance forever. After all, daily life and labor had to continue, so as the sun rose high, he opened his petals once more. This time, he only allowed a faint trace of scent to escape while he waited patiently for the flower to wither and bear fruit. He wasn't worried about the harvest. This flower was clearly not bound by the ordinary laws of nature. It would undoubtedly produce fruit in its own time, but just then, a persistent buzzing sound caught his attention. The noise drew closer from the distance, sounding like a swarm of mosquitoes, a sound that, quite frankly, was starting to annoy him. Subconsciously, he tried to wave an arm toward the source of the noise, momentarily forgetting that he didn't actually have arms anymore. Despite that, the intention translated into movement, and a long branch lashed out, striking something midair with a satisfying thud. He wondered if it truly was a mosquito, though his body usually repelled insects. This one, strangely enough, refused to stay away. Instead of fleeing, it kept circling back, prompting him to focus his attention on the spot where he had just struck the air. At first, we see nothing at all, but soon he spotted a small yellow bee struggling to regain its balance. It wobbled unsteadily as it took flight again, heading straight back toward him, but this time he chose not to swat it away. He watched as it drifted slowly toward his trunk, eventually disappearing into the lush leaves to find the source of the scent. It was a moment of sudden realization. The bee had been lured in by his flower, and it landed softly right beside the petals. The bee then began crawling toward the flower, clearly intent on gathering nectar, an act he simply couldn't allow, so he took control of a branch. With a swift movement, he whipped the branch down, sending the bee tumbling away. However, despite taking a direct hit, the persistent insect wouldn't give up. It continued to crawl stubbornly back toward the flower, even as he struck it again and again with a series of rhythmic thuds. Finally, the bee seemed to snap out of its trance, shaking its head in confusion, as if wondering where it was and how it had followed that intoxicating scent. It remembered the nectar, and as it looked around, it immediately spotted the blooming flower once more, its singular focus returning instantly. The bee charged toward the petals again, leaving our ancient tree quite exasperated as he was forced to lash out with his branch one more time. This time, the bee finally settled down, staring warily at the branch that kept hitting it. One might assume it would take the hint and fly away. Instead, it did something unexpected. It decided to move in, which left him feeling rather puzzled since his trunk was supposed to repel insects. He wondered why this particular bee wasn't being driven off, or if perhaps his natural repellent abilities had limits he didn't yet understand. He chose not to force the visitor out, though he knew that with a single wave of a branch, he could easily evict the tiny intruder. Sensing that there was something unique about this bee, he allowed it to make a home on his trunk, watching as it flew out every morning. He assumed it was searching for food, and every evening it would return. Yet, even though it lived on his bark, it remained obsessed with his flower. At various times throughout the day, the bee would try to sneak closer to the petals, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he caught it every single time, swatting it back until he began to wonder if the little creature actually enjoyed being hit. A month passed, and the flower finally began to wither, its 5 pure white petals drifting slowly toward the ground. He caught them with his branches before they could touch the earth, revealing a small green fruit that had emerged where the flower once bloomed. Even though it was brand new, the fruit was already half the size of a fist, filling him with a sense of quiet anticipation. He couldn't help but wonder what it would become or what powers it might hold, considering the flower alone had strengthened the primitive tribesmen. The fruit born from such a flower would surely be extraordinary. Meanwhile, the bee remained his tenant, even though the blossoms were gone. It occasionally circled his trunk like a tiny guard patrolling its territory, and he simply let it be. But then, one day, something happened in the tree tribe. Suddenly, a fierce argument broke out within the tree tribe, as two groups of people confronted each other, both trying desperately to convince the other side. One side argued that they should drive the outsiders away, insisting that the ancient tree belongs solely to the tree tribe and no one else should lay claim to it. They even suggested killing the intruders to protect their claim, while the other group held a completely opposite opinion. This second group pointed out that the strangers were merely passing by their territory, questioning why they should initiate a battle instead of just letting them leave. They reminded their kin that when they first migrated here, they also passed through the lands of other tribes, and no one attacked them then. They argued that they shouldn't be so cruel, noting that whenever they passed through other territories, they always made sure to leave quickly. However, the first group countered that these outsiders had chosen to set up camp on their land, which surely meant they intended to occupy it permanently. As our ancient tree eavesdropped on the conversation, he began to understand the cause of the conflict. Meanwhile, Haimu sat silently between the two bickering factions. Because he hadn't spoken yet, the two groups continued their heated debate, with both sides trying their best to win him over to their perspective. As the leader of the tree tribe, the matter would be settled the moment he agreed with one side, and so, they finally turned to him for a decision. When they asked what he thought they should do, Haimu remained quiet, as he actually had a completely different idea in mind. But he was somewhat undecided, so Haimu waved his hand and declared that since this matter was vital to the tribe and the ancient tree, he would seek the answer from the ancient tree itself. Upon hearing this, both sides immediately fell into a respectful silence. It made perfect sense to them. If they couldn't decide, why not let their sacred protector provide the solution? Our tree, listening from the outside, was completely caught off guard by the sudden responsibility being thrust upon him. The core of the problem was that even if they asked, he had no way to answer. He could understand them, but he certainly couldn't speak. If these people had a written language, he could perhaps use his branches to write in the dirt, but these primitive tribesmen had no such thing. It wasn't that they were illiterate, but rather that writing hadn't even been invented yet, leaving him wishing he could simply speak like a human. He realized that humans and animals produce sound through vibrations, and suddenly, a realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. He realized that if he could make his trunk vibrate, he might actually be able to produce a sound and finally communicate with them. Our tree was momentarily excited by the idea, but he quickly realized that simple vibration alone wouldn't be enough. At most, he could only control a single branch to tap against his own trunk, producing a rhythmic thumping sound. That was a far cry from actual speech, so he began to recall how human throats and tracheas functioned. He remembered that air from the lungs vibrates the vocal cords to create specific sounds, and vocal cords were exactly what he lacked. But why not simply grow his own? With that thought, he selected a branch and began to accelerate its growth. He channeled a portion of his faith power, a specialized energy that, when controlled, allowed his branches to grow at incredible speeds. As he guided the growth, he tried to mold the wood into the shape of the vocal cords he remembered, a process that might take quite a while. Fortunately, time was the one thing he had in abundance, and within just a few minutes, the branch had already transformed significantly. A rudimentary vocal cord structure soon emerged, followed by a hollow cavity he fashioned to serve a very specific purpose. This cavity was designed to mimic human lungs by absorbing and compressing air, and once finished, he was ready to test it. However, the first breath of air only produced a strange puffing sound, as the new vocal cords weren't nearly resilient enough. He began a long series of experiments, constantly regrowing the branches in an attempt to find the perfect balance of flexibility and strength. In any normal situation, a tree attempting this would be doomed to fail, but as we know, our protagonist is far from ordinary. He was a being fueled by the faith of others, and after dozens of failed attempts, he finally managed to create a functional sound-producing structure. It didn't look much like human vocal cords. In fact, it looked more like a strange, organic musical instrument. It consisted of a cylinder with a small opening and a thin, tough leaf-like structure that acted as the source of vibration when air passed through. While it could produce sound, forming rhythmic speech was still a challenge that would require a bit more practice. He kept these noisy experiments confined to a closed space to avoid alerting the tribesmen, just as Haimu approached his trunk. The leader asked the great tree for guidance, admitting he disliked his people's suggestions and reminding the tree of his vow to spread its name. Haimu's true intention was to absorb the smaller tribe into their own, rather than driving them away or resorting to violence. Haimu proposed making the newcomers our tree's subjects so they could offer sacrifices too, a suggestion that, to be honest, caught our protagonist completely off guard. He hadn't expected Haimu to think this way, but he certainly liked the idea. After all, more followers meant a significant increase in his own power. The more people who believed in him, the more faith power he would receive. It was a brilliant plan, but now he had to decide how to respond. After a moment's thought, he found a solution and controlled a leafless, pointed branch to descend slowly toward the tribal leader. When Haimu saw the sharp branch reaching down, he was instantly gripped by terror and threw himself onto his knees. He pressed his forehead against the dirt, not daring to move an inch. Our tree found the reaction a bit dramatic, but he had work to do. Using the tip of the branch like a pen, he began to draw in the soft soil at Haimu's feet, quickly sketching out a simple image. The artistry was admittedly a bit lacking, but the core message was clear enough. Seeing that Haimu was still face down in the dirt, the tree gently tapped the man's head with the branch to get his attention. Only then did Haimu finally dare to look up. The branch pointed toward the ground, directing Haimu's gaze to the abstract drawing that had just been etched into the earth. The image depicted a great tree, clearly representing himself, with a group of small figures kneeling in worship beneath its canopy. Haimu understood the meaning instantly. He bowed once more, declaring that he knew exactly what to do to bring the other tribe into the fold. He promised to bring them back so they could offer their own sacrifices, and hearing this, our tree rustled his leaves in satisfied approval. With his answer secured, Haimu hurried back to his quarters and immediately summoned the rest of the tribesmen for a meeting. He shared the great tree's instructions. Though some were initially skeptical, their doubts vanished the moment they heard the divine tree had given its blessing. We watch as Haimu leads his people out of the village, presumably to track down the newly arrived tribe and begin negotiations. Whether their journey will be smooth remains to be seen. Convincing strangers to worship a tree isn't exactly a simple afternoon task. Conflict was a distinct possibility, but our protagonist didn't have the luxury of worrying about that right now. His focus was elsewhere. He poured all his energy back into the creation of his vocal organs, and after countless trials, he had developed several different experimental structures. Some resembled musical instruments from his past life, like flutes or pipes, and while they could produce sound, they weren't quite right yet. However, they still weren't quite suitable for speech. Some even resembled the vocal organs of insects, which, to be honest, was an idea inspired by his own resident. He had taken cues from that little bee living on him, and while these structures could produce sound, they were still useless for actual conversation. Eventually, he succeeded in creating a structure capable of human speech, but only after practicing his technique hundreds of times. He finally mastered the art of speaking, refining his tone and clarity through those hundreds of repetitive, solitary rehearsals. This entire process took him 6 full days, and only after finishing this task did he finally have the energy to focus on other matters. We see him glance toward the center of the tree tribe's village, but Haimu is nowhere to be found. He likely hasn't returned yet, and out of sheer boredom, our protagonist quietly moved a branch equipped with his new vocal organs right next to that sleeping bee. A sudden sound, mimicking the buzzing of a giant bee, rang out and startled the poor insect awake instantly. It flew up in a panic, darting around in circles as it searched desperately for the source of that mysterious noise. He watched it fly back and forth, feeling a quiet sense of amusement. It was, in a way, like playing with a pet dog or cat. Except, of course, his pet was a giant bee. He had long suspected that this creature was far from an ordinary insect. It always acted alone, and he had never seen another of its kind. Furthermore, its physical size was quite unusual. It was nearly the size of an adult's fist, a dimension that no normal bee could ever hope to achieve. Fortunately, our ancient tree was large enough that the bee remained easily hidden within his dense canopy, away from prying eyes. Since he actively prevented it from appearing before the primitive tribesmen, no one in the village even knew it existed. 2 days later, Haimu finally returned with his men, but we notice he only brought back his own people. There were no newcomers in sight. It was clear he had failed, which was puzzling. Hadn't he said the other group was just a small tribe? How could they resist Haimu's warriors? Our protagonist was confident that his empowered tribesmen were physically far superior to any ordinary primitive humans. The fact that Haimu hadn't succeeded made him quite curious about what kind of tribe they were actually dealing with. Before long, Haimu arrived to report, kneeling before him and lamenting his own incompetence to the great tree. Haimu explained that he failed to bring the small tribe back. Our protagonist finally spoke, telling him it didn't matter and asking for the specific details. Haimu's face was a mask of pure terror as he looked left and right, unable to find the speaker. "Stop looking," the voice said. "I am right in front of you. I am the ancient tree you speak of." Haimu was utterly shocked, his eyes widening as he stared up at the massive trunk in disbelief. He immediately threw himself to the ground, trembling with fear and awe as he cried out, "Great tree, you can speak." Before he could even get an answer, Haimu began muttering to himself, "I was wrong. Of course the great tree can speak. How could I have been so foolish?" He concluded that they simply hadn't been pious enough in the past to satisfy the great tree, which is why he hadn't graced them with his voice until now. Our protagonist paused, deciding it wasn't worth explaining. He told Haimu not to spread the word or notify the rest of the tree tribe for the time being. He commanded Haimu to explain the situation with the other tribe first. He had a very specific reason for this request, you see. He was afraid Haimu would start shouting for everyone to come and worship him. While every ritual generated power of faith, it was a bit much. To be honest, the constant ceremonies were becoming quite annoying, especially since he received faith even without the formal rituals. The generation speed was just a bit slower, that's all. Haimu climbed up from the ground with a silly grin, exclaiming how wonderful it was that the tree could talk. He then remembered his report, explaining that the small tribe only had about 30 people in total. In terms of numbers, the tree tribe had nothing to fear. So, we have to wonder, why did they fail? Haimu finally revealed the reason for their unexpected setback. Although that tribe was small, they possessed a totem. There was that word again, totem. It seemed to carry a heavy weight in this world. He wondered if totems held some special significance he didn't yet understand. He asked Haimu what kind of totem they worshipped. Haimu replied that their totem was the Xiangwei, and interestingly, they carried it with them during their migration. Could a totem really be moved? He silently noted this information. It was a bit frustrating, really, being a tree that couldn't simply pack up and move. Haimu continued his story. He had met with the rival chief and demanded that they offer sacrifices to the great tree instead of their own deity. But the chief refused, stating they only sacrificed to their own totem. Then, he led Haimu to see the creature they worshipped. It was a black turtle, about the length of a man's arm. Haimu gestured with his own arm to show the size, explaining he then offered a different condition. Haimu told them that if they wouldn't sacrifice to the great tree, they had to leave. Our protagonist nodded silently, listening as Haimu continued. However, the rival chief argued that this land was far too fertile to give up easily. They were willing to fight to decide who truly belonged here. Haimu had agreed on the spot, declaring that the battle should happen immediately. He was quite confident, as we can imagine. He guessed that Haimu's group must have lost, or they wouldn't have returned empty-handed. But Haimu's actual answer differed slightly from his guess. While the tree tribe had received the great tree's blessing and gained stronger bodies, the outcome wasn't as simple as a victory or defeat. It turned out the Xiangwei tribe had also received a blessing from that black turtle, granting them an incredibly powerful defense. Haimu fought their chief, Aoshan, but simply couldn't break through his guard. On the other hand, Aoshan couldn't manage to defeat Haimu either. So, he decided to return to the tribe to seek help from the great tree. Having finished his story, Haimu looked up at him expectantly. He clearly hoped for a gift of even greater power. This, to be perfectly honest, put our protagonist in a bit of a difficult position. He hadn't actually researched how to grant power, and he wasn't sure what to give. After all, he only possessed the power of faith. So far, he had only used that faith to nurture a single flower and grow his branches. That flower was currently producing a small fruit. The fruit wasn't ripe yet, but speaking of the flower, he suddenly remembered something. Back when he dealt with the flower crab, he had saved something. He had carefully collected the 5 petals from that flower. He quickly went to check on them to see if they were still there. Several months had passed since the incident with the crab, yet he found that the 5 petals remained as fresh as the day they were picked. Thinking they might be useful, he controlled a branch to coil around a single petal and lowered it directly in front of Haimu. He commanded Haimu to eat the petal. He didn't suggest trying it. After all, he was an ancient tree, and authority is everything. To show any lack of confidence would be beneath his status. Haimu heard the command and felt a surge of excitement. His breathing grew heavy as he carefully took the petal and, without a moment's hesitation, tossed it into his mouth. As soon as the petal touched his tongue, Haimu's eyes widened. He immediately sat down before the trunk to absorb the energy within. That flower had cost a great deal of faith to produce, so it was certainly no ordinary plant. Haimu closed his eyes, beginning his transformation. He felt a continuous stream of power surging into his limbs, a sensation very similar to when he first smelled the flower's fragrance. But this time, it was far more intense. Haimu quickly realized that this petal must have come from that very same aromatic flower. He was so moved by this realization that he began to weep, tears of pure gratitude, to be honest. He believed the great tree was being far too kind, offering him something so incredibly precious. Suddenly, our protagonist felt a massive surge of faith power, nearly equaling the amount from an entire tribal sacrifice. Looking down at Haimu sitting beneath his branches, he realized this wave of faith was coming directly from him. If there were ranks for faith, Haimu would certainly be a fanatic. Gradually, the chief felt something new forming inside him. He had no idea what this new element was, only that it was flowing through his entire body like a river. With every cycle it completed, Haimu felt himself growing stronger, though our protagonist felt the change even more deeply. He suddenly felt a connection to Haimu, as if they were linked by blood. This was definitely not an illusion. It was a very real sensation, as if Haimu had become one of his own branches, yet remained something distinct. He could sense the man, but not control him. Just then, Haimu snapped his eyes open and stood up with a thunderous roar. The sudden shout gave our tree a bit of a fright, causing his leaves to rustle loudly. Then, we see something remarkable. A pale green mist began to emerge from Haimu, wrapping around his body like a protective shroud. The mist eventually took the shape of a great tree, bearing a striking resemblance to our protagonist's own form. After his roar, Haimu also noticed the transformation. Meanwhile, the rest of the tribe had heard the commotion and came running. They rushed to the great tree armed with wooden clubs and stone-tipped spears, ready for a fight. Instead, they found Haimu glowing with a vibrant green light. Their confused looks prompted them to ask what had happened. Haimu clenched his fists, feeling the raw power within. He laughed heartily before kneeling solemnly before the tree. He thanked the great tree for the gift, vowing to defeat the Xiangwei tribe and bring them back. Finally, the others understood. Realizing the great tree was the source of this miracle, the tribe members knelt in worship, though our protagonist had no intention of handing out more petals. He only had 4 petals left, after all, and as for blooming another flower, well, he didn't have any plans for that just yet. The effects of the petal had exceeded his expectations, and he decided to call the power manifesting in Haimu bloodline power. Since it allowed him to feel a literal blood connection, the name seemed quite fitting. Soon after, Haimu led his people out once again. This time, he intended to defeat the chief of the Xiangwei tribe and force their complete surrender. As Haimu left the village, our protagonist realized he could faintly sense the man's location, another side effect of the bloodline power, most likely. Then, he heard a low buzzing. He knew it was the bee returning from its foraging trip, but as it landed on his trunk, he saw that it was in a terrible state. The poor creature was covered in blood from some unknown creature, and one of its legs hung limp, clearly broken from a fight. It was severely injured. The bee crawled to the junction where a branch met the main trunk and curled its body up tightly. He assumed it just needed a bit of rest to recover, but by the following day, the bee remained in the exact same spot, motionless. It appeared to have died. He extended a branch to bury it beneath his roots, as it had, after all, kept him company for a long time. To be honest, he had already come to think of the little insect as a friend. But as his branch touched the bee's body, one of its legs gave a tiny, weak twitch. It struggled to lift its head, looking up at the branch reaching toward it. Suddenly, he felt a wave of emotion from the creature, a desperate plea for help. It didn't want to die, it wanted to live. It promised to do anything for him, if only he would save it. He agreed without hesitation, though how to actually save it was the problem. He didn't exactly have a background in medicine. Deciding to try anything, he gathered the faith power from within his own body and channeled it through the branch into the bee. The energy flowed in easily enough, but it didn't seem to have any effect at all. The bee still looked like it was at death's door. Seeing that faith power wasn't working, he began to search for another way. He remembered the flower he had bloomed earlier. Its fragrance could restore youth, so perhaps it could also heal wounds. Using his faith power, he attempted to force a tiny flower bud to grow, one no larger than a fingernail. Since the flower was so small, it didn't take much effort at all, and he bloomed it using only a tiny fraction of his faith power. A faint fragrance began to drift from the petals, and as the bee breathed it in, its spirit seemed to visibly lift. However, its physical wounds remained. While it was more alert, the scent alone wasn't enough to actually heal the damage. He continued to pour faith power into the little blossom until a single, shimmering drop of nectar formed at its center. Gently, he fed this drop of nectar to the bee, and the moment the tiny creature swallowed it, something remarkable happened. A layer of green mist began to rise from its body, which immediately reminded him of the mist he had seen around Haimo. We have to wonder if they are the same thing, but the answer became clear as the mist began slowly repairing the bee's injuries. Seeing this, he finally relaxed, knowing his intuition had been correct as the bee's wounds continued to vanish under the mist's glow. The little insect finally stood up, gave its wings a few experimental shakes, and took to the sky, fully recovered at last. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. It seemed the flowers he grew with faith power possessed incredible healing properties. But then he began to wonder if there was a more convenient way to use this, as blooming a whole flower every time was a bit tedious. His thoughts soon turned to his own branches, wondering if he could channel that healing energy directly into his own sap. Never one to hesitate, he began his experiment immediately, focusing his energy on the tip of a bare, slender branch. Soon, a single drop of glowing green sap emerged, and seeing the bee resting nearby, he called his little friend over. It was the perfect opportunity for a small test, so he offered the condensed drop of sap to the waiting bee. After the bee consumed it, the familiar green mist appeared once again, proving that the sap was just as effective as the nectar. He was thrilled to have found the answer. He had developed a new ability, effectively becoming the world's most stationary medic. He would be a tree that saves lives, but amidst his excitement, he noticed his connection to the bee had grown significantly stronger. This felt different from the bloodline bond he shared with Haimo. He realized he could now communicate with the bee's very soul. The bee couldn't speak, of course, only buzzing in response, yet he understood exactly what it was trying to say. Not bad at all. From now on, he decided the bee would be his little subordinate, responsible for patrolling the surrounding area. The bee buzzed back in loyal agreement. He told the bee to call him boss by instead of lord. Since the creature lacked a name, he decided to call him Jinfeng. The little bee was overjoyed to finally have a name, and so, Jinfeng officially became the newest member of our protagonist's small circle. When asked what he could do, Jinfeng proudly claimed he could bite through almost anything with his powerful mandibles. A modest skill, to be sure. He realized that biting things wouldn't be enough, so he wondered if the sap Jinfeng consumed had granted him any deeper power. He wanted to see if Jinfeng could also master bloodline power, which would give the little bee a real fighting chance in this world. Following his instructions, Jinfeng quieted his mind and began to search deep within himself for that hidden strength. Before long, a faint green mist began to drift from the bee's body. He nodded in approval. It seemed Jinfeng did possess bloodline power. However, the green mist soon faded, replaced by a surprising surge of yellow energy, something he hadn't expected to see at all. It became clear that Jinfeng was quite talented, as that yellow mist was another distinct form of bloodline power. This wasn't a gift from the tree, but a power Jinfeng had awakened from within his own body. Soon, the bee was completely enveloped. The yellow mist began to swirl and shift, faintly taking the shape of a much larger, more formidable bee. When Jinfeng finally opened his eyes, he stared in awe at the glowing aura and the massive phantom image surrounding his tiny frame. Our protagonist couldn't teach him much more, as he had only just discovered these powers himself. But a strange question began to nag at him. He wondered why Jinfeng could awaken his own unique power while Haimo could not. After all, Haimo's power only reflected the tree's own image. While Haimo manifested the tree, Jinfeng manifested himself. He could only speculate that different species must have very different spiritual potentials. It was a mystery that required more research, but for now, Jinfeng simply pulled his new power back into his body. Jinfeng asked for permission to head out, and assuming he was just hungry, Boss Bai told him to go ahead and forage as usual. He told the bee he would call if he needed anything, and with a loud, energetic hum, Jinfeng took flight into the distance. But Jinfeng wasn't just looking for food. He wanted revenge on a snake that had tried to steal his meal the day before. Jinfeng explained that he had fought the snake, but lost, which left Boss Bai quite surprised to learn his little bee was competing with snakes for food. When asked about his diet, Jinfeng replied that he ate almost anything he could find, from nectar and fruit to various insects. He admitted he would eat whatever was available. Our protagonist had assumed he was just a simple honeybee, but it seems he was mistaken. It turns out Jinfeng was a carnivore. To be honest, meat-eating bees like hornets and wasps do exist, so perhaps it shouldn't have been such a shock. This realization was a reminder to plan for the future. As the tree tribe grew, they would inevitably encounter other neighboring tribes. In such times, having intelligence on others is vital, regardless of whether the relationship turns out to be friendly or hostile. With information in hand, one can always keep the upper hand. We watch as Jinfeng flies off, disappearing into the distance. He estimated that the snake-raising tribe must be quite far away. After all, his own trunk was now nearly 50 meters tall. His field of vision was incredibly vast, yet even from that height, he couldn't see any other tribes nearby. As for the direction of the Xingwei tribe, there happened to be a mountain blocking his line of sight. A small river flowed right past that mountain, and the Xingwei tribe had chosen the riverbank as their settlement. He remembered that when he first arrived in this world, that river was nothing more than a tiny, narrow stream. Centuries had passed, and the stream had gradually widened and deepened into the river it is today. Meanwhile, we turn to another scene. Haimu had already arrived at the Xingwei tribe with his people. It was a modest settlement, not particularly large. They lived in low houses built of wood and grass. The moment they spotted Haimu's group, they immediately gathered their entire tribe. The men grabbed their weapons while the women protected the children. As for the elderly, they had sadly perished during the tribe's long migration. Haimu stood before the gathered crowd of the Xingwei tribe, showing absolutely no sign of fear. He shouted toward the village, calling out for Aoshan. He declared that their last duel had ended in a draw, and he had returned. He vowed to defeat Aoshan this time and bring them all under the protection of the great ancient tree. Aoshan, the tribal chief, was the one he addressed. Aoshan stepped forward with a dark expression, telling Haimu he was far too arrogant, as their last battle had already proven his point. Aoshan declared that the great Xingwei was no less powerful than this ancient tree, and they would never abandon their worship of him. Haimu let out a cold snort, dismissing their last fight as a mere accident. He was ready to show them the tree's true power. As the two warriors locked eyes, the people of the Tree tribe and the Xingwei tribe formed a wide circle to serve as their arena. Both men gripped their stone spears tightly, watching for the slightest opening. Suddenly, Aoshan let out a deafening roar. He took the initiative and charged. Haimu stepped forward to meet him, and we see their long spears clashing violently in the air. They each recoiled a step from the impact, but immediately lunged forward again, trading a relentless barrage of strikes. The two seemed perfectly matched in the center of the field. Haimu's physical condition was remarkable. He showed no signs of exhaustion. Aoshan, however, was slowly being pushed back, yet his body remained as incredibly tough and resilient as a tortoise shell. Even when Haimu's spear grazed his arm, it left only a shallow mark. Despite being on the defensive, he was far from beaten. Aoshan relied on that iron-like body to withstand the assault. Their last battle had played out exactly like this, a test of endurance. It had been a stalemate until both were spent. Haimu realized that using his natural strength alone wouldn't be enough to defeat Aoshan. He began to channel the inner power granted by the tree, feeling it surge through his limbs and every pore of his body. This energy gathered into a literal river of blood chi. With a sudden, violent shudder of his arms, Haimu released a resonant, bone-chilling sound. That single burst of power sent Aoshan stumbling backward. As Aoshan steadied himself, he looked up to see a truly shocking sight. A faint green light began to glow around Haimu, forming the spectral silhouette of a great tree. Haimu laughed, inviting him to try again. He challenged Aoshan to see how he would win this time. Haimu gripped his spear and kicked off, leaving a small crater in the earth. He launched himself forward like a projectile. Aoshan hurriedly raised his own spear to block the incoming strike as Haimu leaped high into the air. Putting every ounce of his strength into the blow, Haimu brought his spear down. Aoshan's weapon simply couldn't take the pressure and snapped. The shaft of Haimu's spear then slammed into Aoshan with brutal force, sending the tribal chief flying through the air. Aoshan coughed up a mouthful of blood as he landed. The people of the Xingwei tribe cried out in terror, their faces filled with pure dread. The Xingwei people rushed to Aoshan's side as he hit the ground, helping him up while blood continued to trickle from the corner of his mouth. Enduring the searing pain throughout his body, he opened his mouth and shouted for them to go and fetch the great Xingwei immediately. Several tribesmen turned and sprinted back into the village, heading toward a spot near the small river at the rear of the settlement. There, we see a recently dug pond where a large black tortoise lay resting, though at first glance, it seemed quite ordinary. Aside from its somewhat larger size, there was really nothing particularly special about this tortoise's appearance. The panicked tribesmen reached the edge of the pond and fell to their knees, bowing their heads in desperate prayer to the creature. They cried out that the Tree tribe had returned and that their chief had already been defeated in battle. The great Xingwei slowly opened its eyes and lifted its head, staring intently at the tribesman who was speaking. They pleaded for the creature to help them defeat that hateful enemy, and in response, the tortoise simply shook its heavy head. Seeing this, the men jumped into the water, lifted the Xingwei, and began carrying it out toward the battlefield. Outside the village, Haimu lowered his spear as the misty green aura was drawn back into his body within a few breaths. The people of the Tree tribe erupted in cheers at his victory, but Haimu merely waved them off, crediting the ancient tree's power. After joining the chants for the ancient tree, he walked toward the Xingwei tribe and reminded them that they had lost. He declared that, by their agreement, they must now return with him to offer sacrifices and worship the ancient tree forever. Supported by his kin, Aoshan stood before Haimu and insisted that this was not over, for they still had their great Xingwei. Haimu's face darkened with rage at the suggestion that they would dare to break their sacred oath. The Xingwei tribesmen raised their weapons against him, and the Tree tribe warriors immediately prepared to charge in response. Fortunately, Haimu held his people back, preventing a full-scale massacre, though his expression remained grim as he offered one last chance. He demanded they follow him back, but at that very moment, the men carrying the tortoise pushed through the crowd to the front. Aoshan looked at the black tortoise and cried out, begging the great Xiangwei to help them defend against their powerful foe. Haimu immediately grew wary, his body once again shrouded in mist, only to see the black tortoise suddenly open its mouth. It bit down hard on Aoshan's hand, causing him to scream in pain as the tribesmen carrying the creature instinctively let go. The great tortoise hit the ground and, under the astonished gaze of everyone present, simply crawled away without looking back. Seeing their guardian retreating, Aoshan desperately shouted for them to bring it back, while Haimu's expression darkened with intent. The warriors of the tree tribe immediately clashed with the Xiangwei people, while that mysterious black tortoise continued its slow escape. Under Haimu's watchful eye, it reached the river, leaped in, and vanished, leaving the Xiangwei tribe to face their fate alone. Soon, the entire tribe was captured, and Haimu stood over a dying Aoshan, mocking him for being abandoned by his own totem. He declared that the Xiangwei tribe was no more, as Aoshan coughed up blood, his strength finally failing him entirely. With one last breath, the light left Aoshan's eyes, and Haimu took the fallen chief's body to be dealt with. After burying him, Haimu led the remaining Xiangwei survivors back to the settlement, where we see the ancient tree waiting in the distance. Haimu and his men returned in triumph, bringing with them the displaced families of the now-dissolved Xiangwei tribe. These people would soon have to change their names and integrate into the tree tribe, though such a process naturally takes time. Haimu led the newcomers directly before the ancient tree, standing at the front of the crowd to make a formal introduction. He announced that this was the great ancient tree they worshipped, and from this day forward, they would offer it their devotion. The group knelt in unison, yet the ancient tree felt only a tiny flicker of faith, hardly a surprise given the circumstances. Deep down, the tree knew they weren't true believers yet, but it was confident they would soon become devoted followers. After the ritual, Haimu began settling the newcomers. The tree tribe had grown from 61 members to a total of 93. With 32 new souls added to the fold, the village felt much fuller as the quiet of the night finally descended. In the silence, Haimu approached the ancient tree alone, whispering a soft call to the guardian he served so faithfully. The tree wasn't sleeping, it rarely did, preferring instead to occasionally drift into thought and let the world pass by. It was a state quite similar to sleep until a voice broke the silence. Haimu had done well, and he offered a sheepish smile to the ancient tree. He insisted that it was only through the great tree's power that he was able to defeat the leader of the Xiangwei tribe. When asked why he had come so late, Haimu began to recount the entire process of how they had finally subdued their rivals. Once finished, Haimu hesitated before asking if a totem could truly just leave on its own, a question that revealed his inner turmoil. It was clear what he was worried about. He feared that one day, the ancient tree might abandon them just as the black tortoise had. The tree simply asked him in return, if his totem stopped granting him power, would he choose to worship another instead? Cold sweat broke out on Haimu's forehead as he immediately dropped to his knees, desperately swearing his eternal loyalty to the great tree. The tree gently extended a branch to pull him back up, telling him there was no need to be so nervous. It explained it was merely a hypothetical, yet Haimu stood there with a racing heart, claiming he had no thoughts or answers on the matter. To be honest, he didn't dare to have an answer, so the tree decided to simply give him the truth directly. Just as a people can choose their totem, a totem can choose its people. If their actions ever cause it disgust, it will naturally depart. The tree suggested he go and ask the Xiangwei survivors exactly what they had done to make their own guardian turn its back on them. Haimu nodded frantically, ready to go at once, though the tree's words were really just a very educated guess. Still, the reality was likely close to that. Seeing Haimu rushing off, the tree reminded him to wait until morning. It was late and the village was sleeping, so Haimu bowed, wishing the great tree a good rest before making his exit. He left so quickly, it was almost like he was running away, leaving the tree to wonder if it was really that intimidating. After all, it was just a tree, or so it told itself, as it turned its attention upward to the remarkably clean sky. There was a sun and a moon, but upon closer inspection, they both seemed small and perhaps a bit artificial. At night, there wasn't a single star to be seen besides the moon, a detail that only the tree seemed to notice. Having lived in another world entirely, the tree saw things these primitive people had looked at since birth without ever questioning. In the eyes of the tribespeople, that sun and moon were perfectly normal, but the tree turned its gaze back toward the earth. The people of the tree tribe were fast asleep, and even from the Xiangwei camp, the faint sound of snoring drifted through the air. Suddenly, the distinct sound of splashing water echoed from the distant river, cutting through the silence of the night and drawing the tree's attention. There, we see a large tortoise paddling through the water. Could this be the very totem the Xiangwei tribe had lost? Haimu had mentioned that their guardian disappeared into the river, and naturally, the tree found itself quite interested in this sudden visitor. With a swift motion, the tree sent its branches darting toward the river, using limbs it had specially infused with the power of faith. These unique branches could be as soft as rope or as hard as steel. The tree, rather practically, referred to them as tentacles. The large tortoise barely had time to sense the movement before the tentacles had already made contact with its thick shell. It tried to dive deep into the water to escape the reach of the attack, but the vines coiled tightly around its body and pulled. With a single heave, the creature was dragged right out of the water, snapping its jaws at the tentacles in a desperate attempt to break free. However, these were no ordinary branches, and under the tree's command, they instantly became as rigid and unyielding as iron. The tortoise's bite was like snapping at solid stone. It achieved nothing at all, except perhaps risking a few broken teeth. The tree dragged the creature into the canopy, where the surrounding branches and leaves wove together to form a living wooden cage. Even then, the tortoise refused to give up, struggling constantly as the tree took a moment to inspect its meter-long captive. Its body was a deep, murky black, matching Haimu's description of the Xiangwei totem perfectly, which is exactly why the tree was so curious. Haimu had claimed the Xiangwei people were granted a blessing of immense defensive power, and the tree wanted to see the source for itself. Recalling a trick it had learned while saving Jin Feng, the tree attempted to send a direct mental message to the creature. It wasn't entirely sure if the method would work on a tortoise, but it focused its intent on a single question. Was this the Xiangwei totem? The message was pulsed through the tentacles wrapped around the shell, and suddenly, the large tortoise stopped its frantic struggling. The tree felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing the connection had been made, though the tortoise simply stared back in stunned silence. The tree continued, explaining that if the creature simply spoke its thoughts internally, they could understand one another, and the moment the words were sent. The tortoise immediately retracted its head and limbs into its shell, proving to be far more timid than the tree had expected. After waiting patiently for a few moments, a faint signal finally drifted back. I used to be the totem of the Xiangwei tribe. But now the Xiangwei tribe is gone, Great One. I am just an ordinary little tortoise. I beg of you, please let me go. Look at me. I am all shell and no meat. I would taste terrible. Truly, I am not delicious, Great One. But if you are hungry, I can go into the water and catch fish for you. Please let me go. I can catch fish for you every single day. The tree quickly severed the mental connection, as the creature's desperate rambling simply wouldn't stop. It was time to set some boundaries. I can release you, but first, you must be quiet. I have questions for you, the tree transmitted, hoping the message would sink in. Once again, the tree cut the link to give the creature space, and after a short while, the large tortoise finally peeked its head out again. It glanced nervously at its surroundings before pulling its head back halfway. We can assume it had finally calmed down, mostly. Reconnecting once more, the tree asked if it had truly granted blessings to the Xiangwei people, and the tortoise nodded its head cautiously. But Great One, they forced me. It wasn't my choice. The tree found it hard to believe these primitive humans could coerce a totem. The tortoise immediately began to wail its grievances with dramatic flair. Oh, Great One, I am but a humble, ordinary little tortoise. I don't possess immense power like you do. Originally, I was just a normal tortoise living peacefully in a great river. Then one day, those people snatched me from the shore and forced me to be their totem. At first, I naturally refused. I tried to run away the first chance I got, but they caught me and brought me back. And then, they threatened me. They said if I ran again, they would boil me and eat me. They actually threatened me. I only became their totem because I had no choice. The tree wondered if these primitive humans were truly that fierce. Listening to the tortoise's tearful complaints, one could almost imagine its miserable past. It realized then that the people of the tree tribe were much kinder. At least they hadn't resorted to threats of soup. But then, the tree remembered its own arrival. It recalled how, back then, it couldn't have run away even if it wanted to. Suddenly, a sense of crisis washed over our ancient friend. The tree realized that although the tree tribe was respectful now, there was no guarantee their faith would last forever. One cannot tie their safety to others. One must become strong. Meanwhile, the tortoise continued its tale of being a totem. The only benefit, it claimed, was not having to hunt, as they brought food daily. Our ancient friend nodded slightly. This sounded remarkably similar to the sacrifices the tree tribe offered. Then, the tortoise explained they eventually demanded a blessing. But the poor creature had no idea how to do that. This, of course, was the very information the tree was seeking. Driven to desperation, the tortoise eventually squeezed out a few drops of its own blood, and surprisingly, it actually worked. Those who consumed the blood became stronger and less prone to injury. This, apparently, was the secret behind its blessings. So, it was the blood all along. It occurred to the tree that the petals given to Haimu were also parts of its own body. In a sense, the tree tribe was also consuming its flesh and blood. To be honest, the thought was a bit unsettling. Feeling increasingly uneasy, the tree asked another question. When you were a totem, did you feel something new inside you? The large tortoise nodded, confirming it had indeed felt something strange manifesting within its body back then. It mentioned that some of that energy still remained. Do you know what it is, Great One? The tortoise asked curiously. The tree explained that it was power of faith, a force generated within them by the worship of primitive humans. So that is its name? You are truly magnificent, Great One, to know such things. The tree couldn't help but chuckle. It seemed this tortoise was quite the flatterer, likely hoping for a quick release. "Well, I have heard enough," the tree signaled. When asked where it planned to go, the tortoise spoke of finding a new home. The tree suggested, "How about following me? If it settled elsewhere, it might just be captured again." Besides, the tree knew its own strength was still growing. Having a few bodyguards seemed like a wise investment. It already had the bees. Why not add a tortoise to the team? The tortoise asked tentatively if it was allowed to refuse. The tree had meant it as a suggestion, a friendly offer of protection. However, the creature seemed to misunderstand. Seeing the vines still coiled around it, the tortoise gave a very decisive nod. The tree truly intended to let it go, but the tortoise clearly didn't believe a word of it, thinking to itself that trusting a predator was a recipe for disaster. After being released back into the small river, the tortoise promised to stay nearby and even offered to bring the tree a fresh fish every single day. The tree didn't stop it, figuring it was good for the creature to have a hobby. But once the tortoise swam off, our ancient friend fell into deep thought. Looking down at the tree tribe living beneath its canopy, the tree realized it had been viewing them through the lens of its former human life. That was why it hadn't hesitated to give Haimu a petal when he asked for a blessing. But the tortoise's story had changed everything. It had come to a sobering realization. To these primitive humans, it was, in the end, just a tree. If the strength of these tribesmen ever surpassed its own, there was no guarantee they wouldn't turn on their benefactor for their own gain. And yet, the tree couldn't simply abandon them, as the power of faith they provided was essential for its continued growth. From now on, it would have to manage this relationship with extreme caution, neither helping them too much nor letting them drift away entirely. The next morning, Haimu went to speak with the members of the Xiangwei tribe to ask them about their missing tortoise totem. The tree overheard every word of their conversation, and their version of events matched what the tortoise had shared the day before. They admitted to capturing the creature and forcing it to provide its blood for their own benefit. To be honest, they showed very little remorse. After leaving the Xiangwei camp, Haimu looked deeply conflicted as he walked back to stand alone before the great tree. He looked up at the towering, majestic trunk for a long time before finally whispering, "Great tree, I have spoken with the Xiangwei people, and I know now what they did to their own totem," he confessed with a heavy heart. But then, Haimu's gaze became incredibly firm as he declared that the tree tribe would never, ever do such a thing to their protector. The tree listened in silence as Haimu knelt on the ground. "Great tree, as long as I, Haimu, am alive, I will never let anyone cause you harm." As he finished speaking, a massive surge of faith power flowed into the tree. This was quite a relief, making the tree feel that giving Haimu that petal hadn't been a mistake after all. However, it wouldn't let one man's loyalty change its plans for the entire tribe. The tree gently rustled its branches, a soft sound that served as its only response to Haimu's vow. Haimu didn't stay there for long. As the leader of the entire tree tribe, he had many responsibilities to attend to until evening fell. We see Jinfeng return from his scouting mission, diving into the leaves to find a branch. "Boss bye, I'm back," he chirped. The tree acknowledged his hard work and asked for the report. Jinfeng's playful tone vanished as he explained his serious findings. The group in question was known as the Snake Tribe, and they worshipped a massive serpent. It took Jinfeng quite a while to find it. He finally located the beast on a mountain a few hundred meters away from their main settlement. The tree listened, privately thinking that if the creature was truly that large, snake was a bit of an understatement. Python seemed more appropriate. With the continued sacrifices of the Snake Tribe, it was even possible that the creature might one day evolve into a dragon. Whether this world actually allowed for such evolution remained a mystery. Jinfeng fluttered his wings and continued his report. The Snake Tribe consisted of about 200 people who were expert hunters, frequently venturing deep into the mountains for prey. They also raised snakes, with nearly every member carrying one, many of which were venomous. This news weighed heavily on the tree. The Snake Tribe's strength was formidable. Compared to them, our tree tribe had only half the population and an even wider gap in power. After some thought, the tree decided it was time to eventually introduce farming. Currently, the tribe's food source was quite primitive. They relied primarily on hunting, supplemented by gathering. But as the tribe grew, this lifestyle would soon become unsustainable. However, the tree didn't hand over this knowledge immediately. To be honest, timing is everything in the art of divine intervention. While waiting for the right moment, the tree focused its mental energy on a more pressing matter. It began researching how to apply the power of faith directly to combat. Previously, it had used this power in a very limited way. It had mostly used faith to stimulate its own growth, creating those incredibly tough vines we saw earlier. Beyond that, faith could create healing wood or petals that strengthen bodies and awaken bloodline powers. But these were all support functions. In a real fight, they didn't offer much in the way of actual offensive capabilities. Unfortunately, no breakthroughs had been made by the time winter arrived, bringing a severe food crisis to the tree tribe. Many animals choose to hibernate during the winter, which meant the number of creatures left to hunt had dwindled significantly. Crucially, there were no fruits or plants left to gather, and the tribe's primary food sources had completely dried up. Haimu had no choice but to lead his people further away in search of prey, while our tree noticed something strange as winter deepened. The daily power of faith was actually increasing. Upon closer observation, it turned out these primitive people were praying to the tree more than ever. They hoped for more successful hunts, and with every prayer, more faith flowed into the tree as the cold winds began to howl. The tree tribe was finally reaching its breaking point, having gone several days without catching any food at all. It was at this moment that a man named Qingshi, who formerly belonged to the Xiangwei tribe, ran up to Haimu and addressed him as leader. He pleaded, saying they hadn't eaten in days and would soon starve. Haimu's expression was grim. He was well aware of the situation. As the tribe's leader, he understood the gravity of their hunger better than anyone. Qingshi continued, pressing his point further. He asked if they could seek help from the great ancient tree, but Haimu didn't quite understand why they would ask for such a thing. Qingshi argued that since the tree was their totem, it was supposed to protect them. Haimu nodded slowly in response. He agreed the great tree protected them, but insisted that wasn't an excuse to constantly beg for divine assistance. Besides, he felt they hadn't truly run out of options yet. Even without meat, there were still things to be found outside. Haimu was referring to things like tree bark and dry leaves, items that could, technically, fill a stomach in an emergency. Haimu believed they could survive the winter this way, and so he sent the suggesting man away without a second thought. He felt they shouldn't trouble the great tree over such small matters. However, Qingshi wasn't about to let the issue drop. He sought out other former members of the Xiangwei tribe to spread his proposal, and he quickly found others who agreed with him. Since the Xiangwei had been forcibly merged into the tree tribe after their defeat, many of them still harbored a bit of resentment. Qingshi planned to use this food crisis as an excuse to stir up trouble, and under his agitation, the unrest began to grow. Soon, more people across the entire tree tribe shared his doubts. And then, one day, Haimu returned from the hunt empty-handed once again. It was clear that the hunt had failed, and Qingshi immediately seized this opportunity to gather a crowd around him. Haimu glanced at the large group following behind him, noticing most were from the Xiangwei tribe, with only a few from the tree tribe. His brow furrowed with a hint of rising anger as he asked what they were doing there, noting that salty tree bark wasn't exactly a delicacy. He told them that if they were so capable, they should go out and hunt a beast themselves. Several hunters behind Haimu joined in the scolding. The tribesmen shouted for the crowd to move out of the way, asking what they thought they were doing by blocking the path. Qingshi, of course, had no intention of moving, as his goal today was to force Haimu to lead them to the ancient tree. He reminded the leader of his previous solution, to go and beg the great ancient tree to grant them some food. His words immediately found an echo in the crowd, with people crying out that the great tree would surely provide for them. As they pleaded for him to lead the way, Haimu's face grew darker. He realized these people were trying to force his hand. He took a sudden, violent step forward, startling the crowd into a hasty retreat until a heavy silence fell over the clearing. Haimu scanned the circle, memorizing their faces, and asked if this was truly what they all thought. In the face of his gaze, not a single person dared to answer at first, until Qingshi finally braced himself and shouted that yes, this was the will of the people. Haimu let out a smile, a rather chilling one, and agreed to gather the entire tribe to go find the great ancient tree together. Qingshi secretly breathed a sigh of relief, though deep down, he was curious to see how the tree would actually react. If the tree failed to provide food, he would have the perfect excuse to convince the tribe to stop worshipping it altogether. And if the tree actually did provide food, well, he simply didn't believe a mere tree was capable of such a thing. He had been observing it in secret, concluding it was just a very large, immobile plant. To be honest, his skepticism was quite practical. Where would a tree even get food? Soon, the entire tree tribe had gathered before our great tree, whispering amongst themselves. Some believed the tree would provide, while others remained doubtful, with Haimu leading the procession at the very front. He stepped before our tree and led his people in a solemn prayer, unaware that the tree had been watching them all along. Our great tree had seen everything since Haimu's return, noting that the faith power gathered from this ritual was significantly less than before. It was clear that some in the tribe were beginning to waver in their belief, and these changes were starting to take root. Part of this doubt stemmed from Qingshi's influence, and another part from the simple, harsh reality of the ongoing food shortage. When prayers went unanswered, bitterness followed, and so, after the ritual, Haimu stood before the tree with his people. He spoke openly about the hardships the tree tribe was facing and pleaded for a gift of food from the great ancient tree. He begged for a response to their prayers to feed his people, and as his voice trailed off, the entire tree began to tremble. Every leaf erupted into an exaggerated, rustling roar, a sudden display of power that left the crowd utterly stunned. Those who had forced Haimu's hand looked particularly stiff, their faces pale with panic even as they tried to reassure themselves. They whispered that it was impossible, that it was just a large plant, but our tree decided it was time these people learned a lesson. 2 words slowly resonated from the trunk, Haimu. The leader immediately dropped to his knees, answering that he was there to listen. Behind him, the rest of the tribesmen fell to the ground in unison, their faces now masks of pure, unadulterated terror. The ancient tree they worshipped could actually speak. They began to wonder if this was even a tree at all. Haimu, however, smiled secretly. He thought to himself that these doubters were finally witnessing the tree's true power, just as the great tree spoke once more. The voice boomed like thunder, asking if they truly sought food, to which Haimu nodded humbly in confirmation. He explained that their supplies were indeed low and that the people hoped for a miracle. Our tree gave a slow, deliberate nod. The massive trunk shook with the gesture as the tree declared that those with sincere faith would indeed receive sustenance. As those words echoed, the tribesmen lifted their heads, their fear quickly replaced by a wave of intense, hungry excitement. Even Haimu hadn't expected such a direct gift of food. His expression shifted into something far more fanatical than before. His devotion, already absolute, managed to deepen even further in that moment. Then, the tree gave a specific command. Haimu was told to organize the people to come forward one by one, so the tree could grant food based on the sincerity of their hearts. Our tree's words made it clear that food wasn't for everyone. Only those with sincere faith in the ancient tree would receive a share. This immediately sent a chill through the men who had led the charge, forcing Haimu to beg the tree for food in the first place. Since they had essentially no faith in the ancient tree, they were certain to be left hungry, but that wasn't even the worst of it. Their lack of belief would now be exposed for all to see, and without food, they feared they might even be exiled from the tribe. Our tree called Haimu forward first, and following the command, the leader stepped toward the massive trunk with a humble heart. As he knelt to offer his worship, a fresh surge of faith power immediately flowed into the tree's core. In response, the tree extended a supple branch, holding out a dried fish for all to see, a sight that made the crowd gasp in unison. Their breathing quickened at the sight of actual food. These fish were supplies the tree had been quietly stockpiling for some time. The source was none other than the black turtle, who had become a loyal follower and promised to catch a fish every single day. He had kept his word, often bringing more than one, and since a tree has no mouth to eat, our protagonist had to get creative. He had air-dried the fish and kept them safe within a storage chamber formed by his own branches. A clever solution, to be honest. By handing them out every few days, the supply would last until spring, and so, the first fish was placed into Haimu's hands. After giving his thanks, Haimu stepped aside for the next tribesman, but this time, the faith power received was significantly weaker. Naturally, since the faith was lesser, the portion of fish the tree handed out was also noticeably smaller. Finally, it was the turn of the man from the black turtle tribe. Qingshi approached with a heavy heart and knelt down to pray. The faith power he offered was so faint it was almost negligible, a tiny spark that our tree had to search for in the storage room. After some picking and choosing, the tree decided to tear off just the tail of a small fish to give to him. However, the long silence as the tree decided made Qingshi's heart race with an overwhelming sense of dread. Unable to bear the tension, he slammed his head against the ground, crying out that he was wrong to ever doubt the tree's power. He begged for mercy, claiming he didn't even want the food anymore. He only prayed to avoid punishment and promised to truly repent. Qingshi vowed to believe in our tree with absolute devotion from then on, prompting the tree to simply put the fishtail back. It wasn't worth the effort, really. Our tree then commanded Haimu to take the man away so he could reflect on his actions, and Haimu moved instantly to obey. He waved several tribesmen forward to drag Qingshi away and lock him up, forbidding him from coming out. It was a stern response to the situation. Watching this, our tree briefly considered suggesting they build a proper prison, but quickly realized the tribe was still struggling just to find enough food. They clearly lacked the resources for such a project. Once Haimu had Qingshi taken away, the distribution of food continued for the rest of the tribe. One by one, the other tribesmen stepped before the ancient tree to receive their divine gift of sustenance. Before long, almost everyone in the tribe had received their share, leaving only a small handful of people empty-handed. Those few were promptly taken away by Haimu's men to be confined in their homes. After this display of power, something shifted in the air. The faith of the entire tribe surged visibly. In their eyes, our tree was no longer just a large plant or a simple totem. They couldn't quite find the words for what the tree had become to them yet. Our tree then dismissed the crowd, signaling for everyone to return home. However, he kept Haimu behind. The leader knew immediately that the ancient tree had a specific task in mind for him. Our tree spoke slowly, asking Haimu if he understood why today's crisis had happened in the first place. Haimu bowed his head in shame. He confessed it was his failure to manage the tribe, allowing unfaithful hearts to emerge. The tree agreed that he was indeed at fault. Haimu's expression darkened as he braced for punishment, but then, our tree let out a soft, rustling laugh that made the leader look up in confusion. The tree explained that the issue wasn't just about management. The real question was why the tribe was so desperately short on food to begin with. Haimu thought for a moment and replied that they simply hadn't been able to catch enough prey. Our tree sighed inwardly at the answer. Realizing it would be difficult for Haimu to figure it out alone, the tree decided to be more direct, asking if he had ever noticed the grasses that bore seeds. Haimu was stunned by the question. To be honest, he usually only focused on tracking wild beasts and ignored the greenery beneath his feet. He assumed only the women who gathered wild fruit would know anything about such plants. Seeing his hesitation, our tree continued the lesson. Imagine what would happen if we collected those seeds now and planted them in the ground when spring arrives. A revolutionary thought, wouldn't you say? Haimu answered almost instinctively, noting that the seeds would sprout and grow. Yes, they would sprout, and eventually, they would bloom. Our tree explained that by autumn, those plants would yield even more seeds. They only needed to plant a single grain in the spring. By the time autumn arrived, they could harvest an entire cluster. Haimu took a moment to think this over, trying to grasp the scale of it. Trading one seed for a handful? If such a thing were truly possible, Haimu's breathing grew heavy with excitement as he addressed the great tree. He realized that if they succeeded, they would have an abundance of seeds to eat, and winter would no longer be a season of starvation. It was a brilliant prospect, and our tree could see that Haimu finally understood. The leader was already wishing for spring to arrive immediately. He was eager to get those seeds into the ground, but our tree knew that simply knowing how to plant wasn't enough. They needed actual farming knowledge. They would need to learn how to choose the right soil, when to sow, and how to craft tools, concepts these primitive people couldn't yet imagine. All of this required the tree's guidance. Of course, he could have let them figure it out on their own over several years of trial and error. However, our tree felt that would be far too slow. He immediately commanded Haimu to select a few tribesmen and bring them to him. The plan was to pass the knowledge of cultivation directly to them, so they would be ready to transform the land once spring returned. Haimu nodded vigorously, promising to go and select the best candidates right away. He was clearly eager to please. Our tree signaled that there was no need for such haste, as there was still plenty of time before spring to teach them the basics. The only real requirement, of course, was that they weren't too dim-witted. The next day, Haimu returned with 3 young candidates. They were only about 12 or 13 years old, but in the tree tribe, this was already considered the threshold of adulthood. At this age, the boys would usually join the hunt, while the girls were nearly of age to marry. It was a harsh reality of their time. To be honest, the average lifespan of these primitive people was quite short, and reaching 50 was considered a feat of extreme old age. However, this particular group had received the tree's blessing, improving their health and likely granting them many more years of life. Among the 3 were 2 girls and 1 boy. Even before they reached the tree, the boy's complaints could be heard echoing through the clearing. He told Uncle Hay that he had no interest in learning about dirt and seeds. He wanted to go out and hunt with the men. Haimu promptly smacked him. Haimu scolded him, asking what he was saying. This was a rare chance to be taught by the great tree himself, and he was failing to appreciate it. He told the boy that if he shouted for volunteers in the village, people would fight for the spot. The boy looked aggrieved and wanted to argue back. But seeing Haimu raise his palm again, he decided it was best to follow quietly. Beside him, the 2 girls were already watching the scene. They were whispering and giggling to themselves as Haimu brought the 3 of them before our tree, ordering them to study hard and never slack off. The boy muttered that no one would dare slack off in front of the great tree, but Haimu caught it and glared, asking what he had just said. The boy immediately turned to our tree with the utmost sincerity, promising to learn diligently. It was a display that made our tree feel quite amused. He signaled for Haimu to leave the 3 in his care. The boy was named Shanzi, and the 2 girls were called Yu and Qingli. Since childhood, they had followed the adults in worshipping the great tree and were devout believers, even if Shanzi preferred hunting. Deep down, he was actually quite happy to be chosen as the tree's student. Our tree began by asking them a few basic questions. The 2 girls recognized a few types of seeds, but Shanzi knew nothing at all. First, our tree taught them how to select the right seeds for planting. Hearing this, Qingli hesitated as if she wanted to speak, but finally summoned the courage to address the great tree directly. She explained that all the seeds they had collected had already been eaten. The tribe currently had no seeds left at all. In response, our tree extended a branch. At the tip of the branch, the leaves had been woven into a large pouch, and inside it was a vast collection of various seeds. If he intended to teach them the art of farming, he certainly wasn't going to come unprepared. He had already tasked Jinfeng with a special mission. While out foraging, Jinfeng had been collecting plant seeds all autumn. By now, our tree had managed to store quite a significant amount. Some of these even came from far beyond the tree tribe's territory. To be honest, gathering such a rich variety of seeds was no small feat. It was all thanks to Jinfeng's hard work. When the 3 children saw the seeds, their mouths hung open in shock, wondering how the tree had so many. Our tree, of course, didn't answer them, leaving them to their own guesses. With the seeds ready, the real lessons could finally begin. After they learned to distinguish the seeds, he taught them how to craft farming tools and, more importantly, how to actually use them. The 3 were remarkably bright, and it took very little effort to teach them the basics. Then came the practice. He sent them down to the riverbank. They chose a patch of wasteland and used their tools to clear it, turning this spot into a training ground for the 3 of them. This would also be the site for the spring planting. Meanwhile, the other tribesmen watched them digging by the river with great curiosity. As a crowd gathered to watch, our tree instructed the 3 students to explain the principles of farming to the others while they worked. By the time spring finally arrived, the entire tree tribe had a basic understanding of cultivation, and our tree carefully calculated the timing. Knowing exactly when the season had turned, he ordered the 3 children to begin planting the selected seeds into the prepared earth. The rest of the tribe rushed over to help, their faith in the great tree's words absolute, and they spread out along the riverbank. Together, they cleared dozens of plots of various sizes and sowed every single seed. However, planting was only the beginning of the journey. Farming required constant care, from regular fertilizing and pulling weeds to protecting the young sprouts from hungry pests. Even with our tree's guidance, the tribesmen faced many problems during their first attempt. Had they been left to figure it out alone, it likely would have taken years to master these patterns. During this process, our tree discovered yet another of his own unique abilities. He could accurately perceive the growth status of the crops, meaning that even without personal farming experience, he could guide others perfectly. 6 months passed, and several crops with shorter growth cycles had already begun to produce their very first seeds. The tree tribe celebrated its first harvest as Shanzi and the two girls led a group of women and children into the fields. They gathered the ripened crops, including a plant quite similar to wheat, though its grains were only about half the usual size. Even so, for the people of the tree tribe, this was a completely transformative experience. To be honest, it felt like a miracle. It was the first time they had ever obtained food in such a way, and seeing the massive pile of seeds, Haimu's face beamed with joy. With many more crops still ripening in the fields, Haimu could already imagine a future where they simply kept planting and harvesting. The tribe would soon have more food than they could ever eat, perhaps even making hunting unnecessary. Haimu turned to a grinning Shanzi and asked, "So, Shanzi, do you still want to go out hunting?" The boy laughed, replying that the great tree was truly incredible. He recognized that all of this was a gift from the tree, and Haimu agreed, marveling at the blessings their great tree had provided. Shanzi turned to Haimu with a bright smile, suggesting that this winter they would finally never have to worry about going hungry again. The boy proposed clearing even more land to plant every seed they had, and Haimu nodded in agreement, thinking it was a fine idea. However, Haimu reminded him that they had one vital task to complete first, a sacrifice to the great tree, causing Shanzi to slap his forehead in realization. Haimu was right, of course. They needed to offer a proper sacrifice to the great tree, Shanzi said, before a new thought suddenly struck him. He suggested that the title Great Tree might no longer be appropriate, which caused Haimu's expression to drop as he glared at the boy in anger. Haimu barked at the brat, demanding to know what he was playing at, but Shanzi quickly waved his hands, begging his elder not to misunderstand. He explained that the current title simply wasn't grand enough to reflect the true greatness of their protector. It lacked a certain majesty. Haimu wondered what could possibly be more descriptive than Great Tree, and asked the boy if he actually had a better idea in mind. He warned Shanzi that if he couldn't come up with something better, there would be trouble, causing the boy to shrink back and pull in his neck. It was clear that Haimu was genuinely annoyed, but Shanzi braced himself and decided to speak his mind anyway. He mentioned that while studying under the Great Tree, he had heard a specific word that felt perfectly suited for their guardian. When asked what it was, Shanzi spoke the word God. Haimu repeated it, though these primitive people hadn't even invented such a concept yet. The boy used the exact phonetic pronunciation he had learned from our tree, and he nodded firmly to emphasize the weight of the word. He explained that according to the Great Tree, a god is supreme and omnipotent, a being that truly knows and can do all things. Haimu immediately agreed that the Great Tree deserved such a title, and from that moment on, he decided they would call him their god. The two of them settled on the plan, preparing to announce this monumental change to the entire tribe during the upcoming sacrifice. Haimu then led the tribesmen to prepare the offerings. Determined to present something truly magnificent to our tree, he took the hunters out. They successfully brought back a massive wild boar, and Haimu also ordered that a portion of their newly harvested crops be set aside for the altar. Once the preparations were complete, Haimu led the entire tribe before our tree, laying out the bountiful offerings right at the base of the trunk. Unlike other rituals, the tree tribe wouldn't take these offerings back. This time, Haimu placed an entire beast directly before his god. We can see just how much importance Haimu placed on this ritual as he led the tribe in worship, especially after they had experienced such a bountiful harvest. They knew that everything they had was a gift from our tree, and by now, not a single person in the tribe harbored any doubts. Nearly everyone had become a devout believer, and in this single ceremony, our tree harvested as much faith as several previous rituals combined. A massive surge of faith flowed in, bringing a wave of pure refreshment. Once the worship concluded, the next phase of the plan began. Haimu announced to the gathered people that from this day forward, the Great Tree would be known as God, the one and only God of the tree tribe. Our tree was momentarily stunned to hear that familiar word, quickly guessing that Shanzi must have had something to do with this. In truth, Shanzi had wanted to use that title for a long time, though our tree had always stopped him, feeling far from being a true deity. But with Haimu leading the charge this time, it was clear that stopping them would be difficult, even if a direct order were given. If forbidden from using that word, these people would likely just invent another title. So our tree decided to quietly accept it, though God alone felt a bit plain. And so, our tree spoke. If that is the case, then you shall call me the tree god. The people were overjoyed to hear their guardian agree. Haimu immediately led the entire tribe in a thunderous chant, shouting "Great Tree God" over and over again into the sky. From that moment on, our tree had a new name, and with the mastery of farming, the tribe no longer lived in the shadow of hunger. Later, our tree used its unique abilities to help them cultivate even higher-yielding crops, utilizing the power of faith to accelerate the process. Over the next few years, a specific variety of fast-growing, high-output crops was carefully selected and bred for the tribe's fields. By now, the tree tribe no longer relied on the dangers of the hunt to survive, having transitioned almost entirely to a life of agriculture. Beyond the fields, our tree encouraged them to capture wild animals and bring them back, attempting to domesticate them into livestock. 5 years passed in this peaceful manner, and during that time, another small tribe arrived to join the growing community. The population of the tree tribe had now swelled to 230 people, evolving into what was clearly a major regional power. With more people believing, the harvest of faith grew even larger until a vast amount of energy had accumulated within the tree's form. The power of faith was now enough to fill the tree's entire massive body, and on a sudden whim, our tree began to exert control over this energy. Our tree began to guide that energy, letting it merge directly into the trunk. Previously, this power of faith had simply been stored away, left unused. As that massive surge of faith integrated into its physical form, a change occurred. Our tree felt its own body beginning to grow once more. To be honest, its current size had been reached nearly a century ago, and for all those years, there hadn't been the slightest sign of further growth. And yet, a simple experiment today caused the growth to restart. We see the trunk beginning to swell and expand outward with newfound vigor. The roots beneath the earth grew longer and thicker, while the branches above stretched toward the heavens as the great tree began to tower upward. It climbed from 50 meters, growing steadily until it finally came to a halt at a staggering 100 meters in height. By now, its form had become as massive as a small mountain, with a trunk far larger and more imposing than ever before. It would now take at least 7 or 8 people holding hands to circle it, and remarkably, this entire transformation was completed in a very short time. In just over 10 minutes, the commotion of this rapid growth naturally alerted the people of the tree tribe, who came rushing out of their homes. They looked up to see their guardian rising at a visible speed, completely stunned by an existence that now far exceeded their wildest imaginations. Seeing this divine change, Haimu sprinted toward the trunk in a state of pure excitement just as the growth reached its 100-meter peak. Suddenly, Haimu felt a new surge of power erupting within his own body, and with a thunderous boom, he found he could no longer contain it. A brilliant green light burst forth from Haimu, and behind him, the spectral image of the tree formed by that light began to manifest. The shadow-storing mirror was also slowly rising, as if it were growing right along with him. He had grown taller, it seemed. Even at this new height, our tree's senses remained as sharp as ever, immediately noticing the change in Haimu and shifting its full attention toward him. It took only a moment to understand what was happening. The bloodline power within Haimu shared the exact same source as the tree's own body. Previously, our tree could sense Haimu's bloodline as if it were the tip of one of its own branches, but now, that connection felt even more profound. The tree's own growth had strengthened the bloodline within Haimu, which is why he had momentarily lost control over that surging power. The phantom shadow behind Haimu didn't grow for long. After just a few minutes, he was able to regain control over the energy within him. Still, Haimu was left with many questions, and soon, the rest of the tree tribe began to gather around, seeking answers of their own. Naturally, the tribe couldn't ignore such a massive transformation in the tree god they worshipped, so our tree spoke, telling them not to worry. It explained that this was simply a natural part of its growth, and hearing these words, the people finally felt their anxieties melt away. If the tree god said it was fine, then it surely was. They bowed in respect and returned to their tasks, though Haimu remained behind. He looked up and asked if it was just his imagination, or if the power within him had truly grown stronger, and he was right, of course. The tree confirmed that his bloodline power had indeed increased, prompting Haimu to stare at his hands and clench his fists to feel the surge. Looking up once more, he asked if the tree god could bestow this power again, wondering if he himself was being offered even more strength. But Haimu shook his head. He wasn't asking for himself, but rather seeking to pray for this same power to be granted to the rest of his tribe. He noted that he was currently the only one with such strength and hoped others could share it, but our tree didn't give him an immediate answer. In truth, the tree was pondering whether these primitive people possessed their own latent bloodlines, having been too busy teaching them to farm and domesticate animals. For years, there simply hadn't been time to study the matter, so it told Haimu to head back for now while it considered the request. It promised to bestow power when the time was right, and with a respectful nod, Haimu quickly departed from the base of the trunk. Once he was gone, our tree began to observe its own massive form, wondering if it possessed a bloodline of its own since it had provided Haimu's. It began to experiment and research, though it knew an answer wouldn't come quickly. Meanwhile, its 100-meter height was becoming impossible to miss. This change wasn't just noticed by the tree tribe. Far away, nestled within a high mountain range, others were about to witness the spectacle. A few hunters were hiding in the thick jungle, preparing to ambush a Linglu, when one of them happened to glance toward the distant horizon. He immediately spotted the impossibly tall tree, its lush, green canopy rising up like a verdant mountain against the sky. Startled, he hurriedly tapped his companion's shoulder, desperate for someone to confirm whether this was real or just a vivid hallucination. His companion brushed his hand away, whispering for him to be quiet, until the hunter pointed out the massive silhouette appearing on the horizon. The companion scoffed, suggesting his eyes were playing tricks on him since trees were everywhere, yet he still chose to look up. In an instant, he too saw the towering giant and gasped in disbelief, certain that no such thing had existed when they first arrived. Deciding they had to inform their chief immediately, our hunters abandoned their task and whistled sharply toward the surrounding woods. Almost instantly, several green venomous snakes of varying sizes slithered out from the undergrowth, wrapping themselves around the men's outstretched arms. Despite being deadly serpents, they didn't strike. A lucky break, surely, as the group hurried down the mountain with their snakes and tools. Every few steps, they glanced back at the horizon to ensure the giant tree wasn't a hallucination, but as they reached the mountainside, the massive silhouette was suddenly obscured by the jagged peaks, and they felt a sudden, irrational fear that it might simply vanish. They scrambled back up a short distance just to check, and seeing it still there, they finally breathed a sigh of relief and sprinted toward their tribe.